So greetings, everyone, and thank you for attending my AntiquiTEA, both in person and via Zoom. This talk is the end product of my Andrew W. Mellon Fellowship in Object-Centered Curatorial Research and represents collaborative work between myself, Dr. Ruth Allen, and the museum's conservation staff. In the coming weeks, this information will be published on the Carlos Museum's website as a digital exhibition that will coincide with the reinstallation of the Hermanubis statuette in the Greco-Roman gallery. I hope you all have the opportunity to engage with this digital research in the future, as well as the statuette itself. Now, without further ado, we turn to the main subject of my talk. The object at the center of my research is a medium-sized bronze statuette of the Greco-Egyptian god Hermanubis, which measures just over 50 centimeters in height, thus making it a medium-sized statuette. Statuettes of this size are not rare, but they occur in far fewer numbers than their smaller counterparts, thus making the Hermanubis an intriguing piece that contributes to our understanding of classical bronze statuary by adding to the surviving corpus. As the name would suggest, Hermanubis is a hybridization of the Greek messenger god Hermes and the Egyptian god of death Anubis. While initially this mixture of gods may seem oppositional, it should be noted that Hermes was also regarded as the guide of souls to the underworld in Greek mythology, known in Greek as a psychopompos, and that Anubis in turn held dominion over mummification, cemeteries, and the afterlife in Egyptian myth. This joint focus on death and the movement of souls into the afterlife unites these two deities and makes this hybridization an apt combination. The name Hermanubis comes down to us from ancient literary sources of the Roman period, particularly Plutarch and Porphyry, who describe him as being both an underworld deity and a composite half-Hellenic being. As we see with the Carlos Museum statuette, the figure takes on the form of a man with long, wavy hair, idealized facial features, and he wears a traditional Greek garment known as a himation with a bare upper torso. Although the subject of this piece is a deity of hybrid Greek and Egyptian origins, the stylistic features of the work, particularly his stiff pose and the static movement of his drapery, suggest that he is of the Roman period. This assertion is supported by visual evidence depicting Hermanubis, which is largely relegated from the 2nd to the 4th century CE, thus firmly placing the work in the Roman period. Prior to the inception of this research project, little was known about the statuette's history before it entered the Carlos Museum's collection in 1999. Based on documentary evidence from the mid-20th century, we know that the Hermanubis statuette was listed for sale in the German auction catalog Münzen und Medaillen on November 29th, 1958, where it was listed incorrectly as a standing figure of Alexander the Great, with only a footnote suggesting his possible connection to the syncretized god, and thought to originate from Alexandria in Egypt. It is most likely that the artifact was once housed in a private collection before being sold to the auction house. However, we have no documentation on its previous ownership or its find spot. The work was then subsequently sold in 1959 to an unknown buyer before vanishing from the public eye until its reemergence in 1999 at an auction at Sotheby's in New York City. From Sotheby's records, we are informed that the object came from the estate of Ian Woodner. Ian Woodner was a real estate developer, painter, and art collector whose dealings in the art world are documented in various publications from the from the mid to late 20th century. Here, I have provided excerpts from several publications that outline Woodner's collecting habits. The first excerpt is from the New York Times and notes that Woodner began collecting art in the 1950s using money he amassed from his successful dealings in real estate. Additionally, this passage informs us that Woodner's collecting practices were eclectic, noting his purchase of modern French paintings by Odilon Rodin and Greek cycladic sculptures from the Bronze Age. The second excerpt is from the Washington Post and notes that Woodner began collecting art in the 1950s, with 1958 being a particularly active year of acquisitions for his private collection. The third and final excerpt is from another Washington Post article and offers insight and offers important details of Woodner's collection, noting that he described his collection as a universal mismatch of cycladic Greek sculptures, Roman bronzes, Chinese sculptures, post-impressionist paintings, and other works. Based on this documentary evidence, it seems most likely that Ian Woodner was the original buyer of the Hermanubis statuette in 1959, and that the work was restored under his supervision and housed as part of his private collection until his death in 1990. Now turning our attention to the statuette's physical state of preservation, we see that it survives in a fragmentary state. While the statuette's overall appearance is mostly intact, there are noticeable signs of damage. This is particularly evident in the missing left hand and forearm, a missing attribute which would have been placed in his right hand, his missing eyes, signs of pitting on the chest, and areas of corrosion on the front of his drapery. Additionally, when we look at him from the side and rear, we see further evidence of damage with the missing skull cap, creating a large opening in the back of his head, and further signs of corrosion along the backside of his garment. Additionally, when we look at him from the side and rear, pardon me, also we see evidence of restoration work done on the statuette's left shoulder, which looks both bulkier and smoother in its current state than it did in the auction catalog photos from 1958. In all, these areas of loss and reconstruction have rendered the artifact physically different than its original state, and in the case of his missing attributes, they have effectively erased his identity as a syncretized version of Hermes and Anubis. Therefore, in order to comprehend the work as a whole, we must first understand the standard iconography of Hermanubis in the Greco-Roman world. And that's just to show you the area where significant change is noted, as we can see in the patterning of the drapery there. So the iconography of Hermanubis follows a fairly standard visual formula, which is exemplified by a marble cult statue currently housed in the Greco-Roman Museum in Alexandria, Egypt. The god is depicted in anthropomorphic form, that is, as a man, with leonine hair, a broad face and neck, idealized facial features, and wearing a himation over his bare chest. From the top of his head sprouts an object known as a modius, which is a basket used to hold and measure grain, a likely allusion to the bountiful harvest provided by the Nile River. The modius was first adopted for images of deities during the reign of Ptolemy I of Egypt for images of the god Serapis, another syncretized deity who wore the agricultural basket as a crown in a similar fashion to Hermanubis. Arguably, this visual marker serves as a way to connect Hermanubis back to his Egyptian roots by drawing parallels to Serapis. This Egyptian connection is further strengthened by the presence of a palm leaf in his left hand, which alludes to Egypt and its foreign flora and fauna. Unfortunately, the attribute in his right hand has not survived in its entirety, leaving only a small fragment clasped in the palm. However, depictions of Hermanubis on coins minted in Alexandria offer us insight into what this item was. As seen on a on a tetradrachmon of Philip II from the 3rd century CE, we see a depiction of the god in anthropomorphic form with both of his attributes present. Here, the item in his right hand is shown to be a staff tipped with 2 intertwining snakes. These serpents denote the object to be the caduceus, an attribute of the god Hermes in Greek art, thus serving as a visual connection to the Hellenic aspect of Hermanubis. In this respect, the attributes of Hermanubis work in tandem to signal his syncretized nature to the viewer, with the palm leaf symbolizing Egypt and the caduceus symbolizing Greece. So as evident by the provenance of the previous works used to discuss the gods' iconography, being the cult statue and the coin. This anthropomorphic form of Hermanubis is largely relegated to Egypt. In one respect, this may be due to the lasting impact of Hellenistic culture from the Ptolemaic period on the conception of gods in the Hellenized cities of Roman-era Egypt, something that occurs in depictions of other hybridized deities like Serapis, Isis, and Harpocrates, who all frequently are depicted in anthropomorphic form. In another respect, this may also be due to specific beliefs related to Hermanubis' role as a god associated with the afterlife and a figure closely tied with local priesthoods. Based on epigraphical and literary sources from Roman Egypt that date between the 2nd and 4th century CE, we know that Hermanubis was worshipped throughout Egypt and that some priests even bore his name. Thus, the standardization of the anthropomorphic Hermanubis is likely tied to this cultic connection. Arguably, we see that very aspect of the god depicted on a fragmentary relief sculpture from Alexandria. Here, the figure of Hermanubis, identified by his modius, leonine hair, and idealized facial features, is shown looking down towards an unknown person or object with a lit torch present. While we cannot know the nature of this scene, the presence of a torch suggests it is a scene of ritual, and Hermanubis' inclusion may likely indicate it is one connected with death, such as a lamentation, an embalming, a burial, or even the ushering of a soul to the afterlife. An interesting aspect of the iconography of Hermanubis is the fact that the god has an alternate form that pulls more strongly from his Egyptian roots. Termed polytheomorphic for its mixture of multiple deities into one being, this alternative version of Hermanubis is made manifest in a marble statue discovered in 1749 on privately owned land by the papal Pamphili family on the outskirts of Rome and currently housed in the Vatican Museum's collection. Here, the god is shown with a jackal's head placed atop a human body wearing a voluminous tunic and holding fragmentary remains of his palm leaf and caduceus. The statue's support has been sculpted to mimic the appearance of a palm tree, further alluding to the god's exotic origin. This depiction of Hermanubis intentionally depicts him as a polytheomorphic deity, effectively playing into the Roman interest in Egypt as a land of exotic wonder. The appearance of this polytheomorphic Hermanubis appears to coincide with the popularity of the cult of the Egyptian goddess Isis throughout the Roman world. Isis was worshipped throughout the Mediterranean as a mother goddess who was strongly associated with women, many of whom were noted in funerary inscriptions to be followers and priestesses of the goddess. This fact makes the appearance of the jackal-headed Hermanubis on the side of a Roman woman's gravestone all the more interesting. Based on the inscription and the presence of a sistrum, an instrument frequently shown in association with the cult of Isis, we know that this woman, identified as Fabia Stratonike, was a worshiper of Isis. The presence of Hermanubis on the side of her funerary altar tells us not only that he too was worshipped by followers of the Isiac cult, but also that Romans outside of Egypt regarded him as a deity associated with death, thereby supporting the assertions made about the god by Plutarch and Porphyry. In addition to being depicted as a member of the Isiac circle, Hermanubis seems to have also served a more magical function because he appears quite regularly on engraved gems throughout the Roman world. This example of his image on a carnelian intaglio in the British Museum offers insight into this phenomena. Here he is shown in a manner very similar to the Vatican marble statue, with his jackal head placed atop a draped human body and holding a palm leaf and caduceus. The indication of a ground line beneath his feet suggests that we are looking at a statue of the god rather than a living depiction of him. Pliny the Elder notes that gemstones were believed to carry magical abilities that connected the materiality of the stone with the image engraved on it. Thus, the appearance of Hermanubis, of a Hermanubis statue on an engraved gem was thought to bring about a desired outcome, once again playing into the exoticism of the god's Egyptian origins. Based on this iconographic assessment of Hermanubis in Roman art, it seems most plausible that the marble statue of the god from Alexandria offers the best source for a possible reconstruction of the Carlos Museum statuette. The Alexandrian statue, like the Carlos Museum statuette, is anthropomorphic in form and has a similar stance and physical appearance. However, before any talk of reconstruction work can begin, it is first imperative to begin to understand how the statuette was made, and in order to do so, we must begin by analyzing its physical makeup. For this technical inquiry, I assisted the Carlos Museum's conservation staff as they performed the necessary tests. So one of the first examinations performed on the statuette was photography done under ultraviolet lighting. UV lighting causes certain substances to fluoresce because of the presence of so-called phosphors in their chemical makeup, which are excited by the violet which are excited by the ultraviolet radiation and emit light in response. As seen in the photo provided here, we see that there are glowing areas around the statuette's neck, right arm, and shoulder, and that the intersection of its chest and drapery, thus indicating that the statuette was extensively restored from separate pieces, which are held together by an adhesive and overpainted for aesthetic purposes. Based on this finding, the conservation team suggested we perform further testing in order to determine the relationship of the statuette's parts to one another. It was decided by the conservation staff that new X-ray images of the statuette were needed to investigate this issue, and we were able to have them performed at the Emory University Hospital. X-ray imaging requires electromagnetic radiation to be beamed through the Hermanubis statuette to produce a digital image of its interior. Advancement in digital X-ray technology allows us to manipulate the contrast and enhance the image for more nuanced examination. The X-ray revealed several areas of damage beneath the statuette's overpaint, these being a significant crack along the statuette's neck and collarbone, a slight abrasion on the upper section of its right arm, and a major area of loss along the left shoulder and upper arm, which is not visible from the exterior. The transparency of the shoulder piece tells us that the fill is not metallic and is likely a waxy resin, thereby explaining why the statuette's left shoulder appears different from the 1958 auction house photographs. We also notice that there are tubes inserted into the statuette's legs in order to stabilize them, as well as the modern screws, which are shown to go further into the legs. Additionally, the X-ray imaging revealed the presence of cloudiness on the front of the statuette's drapery. It was suggested by Renée Stein and Caitlin Wright that this phenomenon was due to this section having a higher concentration of lead, which blocks the scatter of X-rays, hence why it appears cloudy in the image. To further inquire into the interior structure of the statuette, it was determined that we should use an endoscope. This required the use of a camera and light mounted onto a long tube, which allowed us to peer into an opening underneath the statuette's drapery. There were no major discoveries made using this analytical technique. However, we were able to confirm that the fill in the statuette's shoulder was in fact resin, and that the adhesive is what was placed in the cracks and abrasions along the neck and on the arm, thus supporting the finds identified in the UV photography and X-ray imaging. One of these techniques, or one of these technical approaches, was X-ray powder diffraction analysis, or XRD, which identifies the phases of crystalline material to determine its composition, thereby identifying the material present. Ancient literary sources note the use of silver and other inlay material for the eyes of statues and statuettes in order to give them a more soulful appearance and to add a spark of life. We decided to perform this technical analysis on the Hermanubis statuette to see if we could prove that it had silver eyes. The XRD revealed that the eyes are filled with a calcium carbonate-based material resulting from the modern restorations, and that one of the eyes has traces of silver alloy. However, XRD is not able to tell the difference between gold and silver because they have similar chemical structures. This finding suggests that silver may have been used for the Hermanubis statuette's eyes, but we have no way of determining this conclusively. The final technical approach used to examine the Hermanubis statuette was X-ray fluorescent spectroscopy, or XRF, which is a form of inorganic analysis that shoots a beam of X-rays into the object in order to identify the elements and alloys that are present in its medium. We performed the XRF analysis at 13 separate points on the Hermanubis to determine the composition of the statuette's various pieces. Overall, the XRF revealed a fairly consistent elemental makeup throughout the various parts of the statuette, with copper and tin making up the largest percentages, along with traces of iron, thus confirming that all of the pieces are ancient and that they belong together. However, the XRF analysis also confirmed the conservation team's suspicion that the frontal section of the drapery contained higher levels of lead. This find tells us quite a bit about the production of the statuette because lead lowers the cooling point of the bronze alloy and allows it to flow more easily into a mold, which would have been necessary for the detailed areas of recession in the drapery folds. Based on this find, we confirmed that the statuette was made by way of the lost wax technique. So this process, presented here as a pictured diagram, involves the creation of a clay model, which was then covered with sections of clay or plaster in order to make an individual piece mold for each part of the body, which was then used to replicate a wax version of the work. The wax replica is then filled with a mixture of clay, sand, and fiber to form a core, and once removed from its mold, is further styled to match and design like match the design of the original work. Next, pins are inserted into the wax model to hold the core in place, and channels are added to make passageways to receive the molten bronze. And another mold is made over the outside of the wax model from a similar clay mixture as the one inside of the wax figure. Then the casting mold is heated and the wax runs out, leaving a void shaped like the wax replica. And the molten bronze is poured inside and left to cool before the outer mold is broken. The channels are cut off and the pins are removed. And then the statuette is assembled with extra pieces added, such as hands and legs, if necessary. I present here a red figure kylix dating to the 2nd decade of the 5th century BCE as an example of both the process of statue assembly and the atmosphere of the ancient metalworking workshop. A seated worker tends to the fire of a large furnace on the right or on the left. As a young apprentice, largely obscured by the apparatus of the furnace, tends to the fire. Another worker stands behind him, waiting to hammer the newly fired piece into form, as yet another bronze worker is shown on the far right, assembling a life-size statue with a bronze head at his feet. Various bronze body parts and tools of metalworking are shown adorning the walls of the workshop. While this imagery shows us the construction of a life-size statue, it does not shed light on the reason as to why medium-sized statuettes are made this way. In order to inquire further, technical comparisons to other statuettes are necessary. So typically small statuettes and figurines are made by way of solid casting, which involve pouring molten metal directly into a mold. This means that these works tend to be smaller, less detailed in appearance, and quite heavy. Here I offer a comparison in the form of a small Hermanubis statuette, which is solid cast and shows the limits of this casting technique. When compared with the Carlos Museum's Hermanubis statuette, the smaller version has fewer surface details and a more static pose. A more appropriate comparison for the Hermanubis statuette is another medium-sized bronze housed in the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, Maryland. This statuette depicts a nude version of the Greco-Roman god Apollo and is said to be of Egyptian origin. However, its provenance is not firmly documented. Unlike the Carlos Museum's statuette, the Apollo has not undergone any extensive overpainting of its exterior, and what we see is the original ancient surface of the artifact. This allows us to note that that like the Hermanubis statuette, he too is composed of hollow parts pieced together by way of soldering. This similarity in construction tells us that medium-sized statuettes like the Apollo and the Hermanubis were constructed in this manner because it allowed for the efficient use of materials, created large statuettes that were still relatively lightweight, and allowed for works to be constructed faster by making groups of interchangeable parts. However, it should be noted that the lost wax technique is not isolated to the Mediterranean world, nor is it only relegated to bronze. Here we see a medium-sized statuette of the god Mercury from a Gallo-Roman sanctuary at the ancient site of Bertheville, modern-day Normandy in France. The statuette is made of silver with areas of gilding, and like the Hermanubis statuette, it too is hollow cast. Based on this discussion, we may note that the lost wax technique was indeed a necessary process in the creation of the medium-sized statuettes, but it cannot be used to place a firm provenance on unrecorded discoveries like the Hermanubis statuette. Unfortunately, the problem of context is a broader issue that cannot be adequately addressed in a short talk. Thus, I will be quite brief in my discussion of it today. However, there will be a more thorough discussion of this on the digital exhibition of the object. We know nothing about the original find spot of the Hermanubis statuette. However, based on the prior iconographic analysis, it seems quite likely that it is Egyptian in origin. Yet simply stating that the statuette is from Egypt does not answer the larger question of its original context. Context does not only mean the country or city of origin, but also includes an artifact's original function and means of display. Because we lack this information, we can know there can be no conclusive determination as to what the statuette was intended for. While such a work may have adorned the atrium of an elite Roman home near the Nile Delta, or decorated a Nilotic garden landscape, or even used as an object for dedication or worship at a shrine or temple, we can only theorize and offer comparisons to provenance objects that have a more firm archaeological context and existing archaeological data. Thus, we may conclude this discussion of the Hermanubis statuette by noting how technical analysis and iconographic comparison allow us to understand and reconstruct artifacts that are in a highly fragmented state. It is through this mixture of art historical research and scientific analysis that we have gained insight on the statuette's physical makeup and means of production. Traced its modern history from auction house to museum, and use visual evidence to retrieve his identity from the dark corridors of history. And with this newfound understanding of the artifact in question, I conclude my talk. Thank you.